Hey, y'all. My name is Xavier Ramey. I'm the CEO and founder of Justice Informed. I'm really excited to hop on this live stream just to talk about a couple of things that are going on right now. For many of you all, if you're watching this, you're probably a practitioner of the work of social impact. You may be working inside your organization. You may be a person who has a title such as a diversity, equity, inclusion lead or coordinator or manager or director or otherwise. You may be someone who's in charge of strategy, right? So you're looking at this question of how we create social equity, how we create social impact in organizations by thinking about how the many different areas of your institution operates, whether that's your operations and finance, your marketing communications, your leadership and governance protocols, your team and culture and talent, or maybe it's through your core business or primary services or products or goods. You're looking at this question of how people and organizations come together, and you're thinking about this strategically. At Justice Informed, we work with all different types of folks who are interested in social impact. Everyone from the practitioner, who's responsible for strategy, over to the implementer, who's responsible for getting it done, over to the people who are just volunteers, maybe on a DEI council or an employee resource group or business resource group, someone who may be on a community council charged with understanding how a government organization can better serve the work of equity for them as residents of their local area. We work with all these different types of people. And what often comes to us is this question of why are we going so slow in this work of social impact? And why aren't we seeing this the same way when we're talking about an organization moving forward? Let's zoom out a little bit and let's talk about what's happening right now in America. And I'm just talking about the US context right now. Right now, we have a situation where the idea of equality, this word that says we are all equal, we are people who were all required to have the same rights and opportunities enshrined in our Constitution, afforded to each of us, regardless of our identities, regardless of our income, regardless of who our parents were, that we should have equal access to the opportunities to go to work where we want to go to work, to live where we want to live, to buy things that we want to buy, to love who we want to love, to participate in our economy or our social sphere, however we want to participate, so long as it's within the bounds of the law. And the reality is that that's great on paper. That's great to say. That's great. The reality is equality is an outcome. And that's one of the things that's being misconstrued right now. Equality is an outcome. It's a goal. It is not an evidentiary data point that says where you're at right now in society. And it's also not a specific type of work to be done. Equity is what that is. And right now, the work of equity is greatly under attack. In 2020, a lot of organizations jump into the work of diversity, equity, inclusion. They jump into the work of corporate social responsibility. If you're working for a big corporation, you've probably heard of ESG, environmental social governance. They jumped in and they said, we want to be more forward thinking on this. They jumped in and they signed the CEOs for Action Pledge. They started to hang up banners that said things like Black Lives Matter. They started to talk about the importance of women in the workplace and the pay equity gap and gender equity and the question of accessibility and those with disabilities being able to have a right to come into the workplace and for the work time and hours and hybrid environments to be more inclusive and accessible and these sorts of things. We saw this great groundswell in 2020, and now we're seeing this incredible retraction. A lot of it was already starting shortly after 2020 when George Floyd was killed, and a lot of people's focus went to this question of organizations, people, and social impact. Within about 9 months after the murder of George Floyd, and we saw a massive upswing in conversations about workplace equity and belonging and such, we started to see the retreat. We started to see more and more organizations and people starting to talk about how this work is at worst, it's discriminatory. It's unjust. It's a form of active discrimination against people who, people like myself might say, these folks have privilege. That we were attacking people and saying, because you're white, because you're male, because you're straight, because you're this, because you're able-bodied or otherwise, you should have something taken away from you. And that's what they interpreted our language to be. That is not at all what we were saying. Now we're in a situation where the tiny tendrils of activity that organizations that had not really had much of a history or experience in the work of social change, they got their feet a little wet, And I think that the wave is starting to make them feel like they're drowning. Um, they didn't have their work deeply rooted. They didn't have it deeply defined, and they didn't really know that their teams weren't fully on board with the statements they may have been making. And now they're starting to pull these things back. Um, we're having this fight over equality. We're having a fight over the idea of equality, even the definition of what the word may mean. And not only what the word may mean, what it means for organizations, for businesses, and for people. Let's give an example. Just a couple weeks ago in the state of Texas, a group of white plaintiffs went before the Texas Supreme Court and they won a case that said that the federal agency that is responsible for supplier diversity strategies and assistance as it relates to minority and women-owned businesses, so racial minority and women-owned businesses, was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court agreed with them. Why did the Supreme Court agree with these white plaintiffs? Well, they said, listen, if the U.S. Constitution says that everyone is equal, everyone has a right to the same thing, and everyone is equal who is a citizen of the United States, then having a federal agency that is specifically set up for disadvantaged people presupposes that some Americans are disadvantaged or are unequal. And if an organization, if a federal agency is created that is specifically for people who are disadvantaged, then it flies in the face of the Constitution saying that no one is. If an institution is created in the federal agency or within the states that says that we have specific programs for women or for people of color to get support for their businesses, then that means that women and people of color are not equal. And that is against what the Constitution said, because the Constitution said that we were. And if that is the case, then this federal agency is thus unconstitutional. And the ideas of supporting disadvantaged people is thus seen as un-American. That is a wildly dangerous interpretation. And I believe we're at that point because we have not defined or enshrined into law any sort of a civic or social or corporate responsibility to do the work of repair for generations and centuries of active disenfranchisement, active racism, active sexism, the withholding of jobs, opportunities, and the ability for people with minoritized identities to actively engage in our economy. We don't have language for repair. And that's what's creating, I think, this challenge right now, where people are saying, we want to do equity work, but the moment you say you want to have a goal for women in the workplace, people say that that goal is a form of discrimination against people who aren't women. The moment that you want to say, hey, we want to create an organization that helps Black-owned business owners get their companies off the ground, even though the average Black-owned business pales in size and revenue, in employee count, versus the average American white-owned business. We have no language for repair, and we are sinking very quickly into this vocabulary minefield of equity versus equality. And we're doing that because of the lack of definition to begin with about what equality is versus what equity is, equality being an outcome, equity being a pathway towards it. Secondly, we're seeing these legislative attacks that are not going for these attacks on equity that are not having a commensurate response from those who believe in the work of equity. We're not seeing things like what I've been calling for years, like the Inclusive Economic Growth Act. We're not seeing a lot of traction around these from what I think the people who would mostly support these things would be the liberal left. We're not seeing a lot of conversation at the national level about creating and advancing federal policies to reinforce, like meaningfully reinforce things like the Community Reinvestment Act, which was a central piece of legislation to stop the practice of redlining, which was the ability for banks to not lend to census tracts where people of color primarily lived. Even though they would take their money, they wouldn't give them money to invest or to grow their businesses or to buy homes. And that was outlawed in 1977, but we need to expand that. And there's not meaningful conversation right now to do that across the country. There's pockets of it, like in places where I live in the city of Chicago and in the state of Illinois, but that's not something that's happening wholesale. So legislation against the work of equity towards a more equal nation is not happening at the same pace as legislation to attack and undermine the work of equity towards a more equal nation and more equal workplaces. And then also we have more emboldened people. People ask me what's the difference between 2020, 2022, and 2024 as it relates to DEI and social impact. I always say, in 2019, before George Floyd was killed and before this racial reckoning happened, it was hard to get partners. And in 2020, it became easier to get partners. And a lot of people wanted to be the friend of folks who were already on the front lines of this work of social transformation vis-a-vis the American organization. And the people who were enemies of our work, people who were against our work, they got a little quiet. They got quieter in 2020. In 2024, our friends are quiet. Our partners are fewer. And the people who are against this work are loud and educated about the ways in which we do our work. And they're educated in our tactics, and they're more skillful in undermining us and knowing that we don't have the support of our friends. Because many people who are friends of this work, I think, are increasingly, they're afraid. They're afraid of the risk. So what does this have to do with path and pace? And what does this have to do with Justice Informed? Let's start to bring this in. This is the current state of the work. People want to do the work of creating more equitable workplaces. They want to do the work of creating a more equal society. When you ask many Americans, they're probably not going to say, I want an unjust country. I want to live in a country where women don't make the same as men. I want to live in a country where queer people are afraid to go out on the streets. I want to live in a country where Black people are hunted by police. I want to live in a country where people of Latinx descent feel that they are the scourges of our society, and they should never be getting jobs that pay well. And I don't know a lot of people, and not even whether I know a lot of people who would agree with things like that. I know that it is not true that is the intention of the vast majority of people. The challenge is whether their interpretation of the way that we get to equality is actually going to get us there, or whether it's not, right? We have to define a clearer path forward. The first things that I think we need to do to get to this point of consensus, is we need to talk about how we can get clear on language. We have to get clear on this. When Martin Luther King said, I have a dream that my children will not be judged on the basis of their skin color, but on the content of their character, I can't imagine that he thought 60 years later, white folks would be saying that to me, an African American, to shut me up about the important work of economic equity and racial justice. But that's what's happening right now. Right? His phrases about equality are being used to suppress the work of equity. The Constitution, right, in having enshrined in it that it believes that all people are created equal, is now being used as a defense for destroying and dismantling organizations that are created to help those who, at the time of the writing of the Constitution, would have been enslaved, or would not have been considered citizens, or would not even have had a pathway to citizenry, or may not even have been able to hold elected office like women couldn't, or own a business like women couldn't, or build like the very people who need the work of specific solutions are now having to feel berated and be stalled out by the very language that was created, that was said to be the expansive language of our founding fathers to create a nation that eventually would get to equality. If it's going to eventually get to equality, then we have to figure out what the work to get there is. And now people are making the work itself illegal. So we need to get clear on language. Does America and does your organization have a language for the work of equity in its missional purpose? So when you think about, if you're working at a bank, or you're working at a nonprofit, or you're working at a foundation, or you're working at a library, or you're working at an engineering company, or whatever it may be, when you're working there, and you're talking about creating an employee resource group, does your actual organization, or you're talking about creating a diversity, equity, inclusion council, when you start talking about the need for bringing more people of color, more women, more queer folks, et cetera, into the workplace, not only that, ensuring that their experience of the workplace's policies and practices are actually visibilized in the actual documents, right? That their experience is visible in the documents of this organization. When you start talking about that work, is there any sort of clarity about the responsibility of your organization to those types of persons? If people are not treated equally outside, can your organization prove through its culture, through its policies and its practices, that they will be treated equally inside? And that should be something that should be clearly defined on paper, both the what and the why. So one, we need to get clear on language. The second thing we need to do is we need to enshrine into our laws, into our corporate policies, into our social norms, a way of making restoration and empowerment work legal and protect the types of policies that change how equality is gained for people who lack it in the outcomes, not just in the intent. A lot of people, the people who are detractors of DEI and social impact work right now, who are detractors of the path to get to equality, they're often saying that, hey, our job is to create an equality of opportunity towards outcomes, right? If you put in the work, you will get the result. And they're saying that every workplace should be able to say, we know that if you put in the work, you'll get the reward. And that's based on people's desires to create a meritocracy, a society based on work, creating an output, and that if you do what someone else does, you should get the same result. The reality is that's just far too simple. That is just wildly simplistic in thinking, that if we do nothing and just say there's a job opening, and society is still organized the way it is, that everybody's going to find their way to that job opening in the same way, right? We know that, let's talk about that, right? Like, so we know that digital literacy is a real thing. We also know that digital access is a real issue. Go ask people at Comcast or Xfinity. Go ask the people at Apple. Go ask the people at Lenovo. Go ask them about the question of digital literacy and accessibility and the democratization of digital access. And they'll tell you that there are real gaps in people's abilities to access the digital experience, even though most people get their jobs nowadays not by walking into some HR office and saying, what jobs do you have? Or going down a street, like back in the old days, looking on a pin board and seeing what jobs are open and taking off a little piece of paper and calling the number. That's not how people get jobs. They get jobs because they have access to the internet. They get jobs because they have access to equitable transportation to get to jobs in central areas. They have jobs because they're able to see where their jobs are, apply for them, often through digital means, etc. And so if the world itself, if the companies are saying that digital access is not equitable or even equal, then why would you think that you can can create a job posting and women are going to find it and Black and brown folks are going to find it and queer folks are going to feel like they can apply in that company and feel safe without having a specific solution to attract them, to retain them, to engage them, to empower them, and otherwise? You're going to have a specific strategy. If society isn't equitable, if we know that there's a reason why the wealth gap exists, and it's not just because people of color are lazier than white folks. We know that women don't make the same as men, and it's not because they're not as hardworking. If we know that to be the case in society, then you have to have a specific language, lens, and strategy for it inside your organization. That needs to be enshrined on paper. But first, we have to make it legal to even do that. And what's happening right now is laws are being created to outlaw goals. Right? Laws are being created right now. Legislation is being passed in 14 states right now. And it's already passed in 17 states have passed at least in one chamber of the legislative branch, anti-DEI, anti-talent focused legislation to make specific strategies, things that companies and organizations can pursue. When we look at that, then the next step that we have to do to define a path forward for the work of equality is to actually enshrine into law that the work of equity is legal. The next thing that we have to do is we have to think about how we speed up the work that's already happening, right? So we have to define a clear path and get clear on where are we going, and that's the work of equity. We have to enshrine into law and protect it, the work of equity, but then we also need to start accelerating this work that we are doing. We've got Clients of Justice Informed who are doing great work. We've got folks who, we were just on, just this past week, we've been working with several banks, JP Morgan and Wintrust and Huntington and Fifth Third and others about their racial equity commitments and ways we can support them to move forward with local government offices here in the state of Illinois. We get to work with, organizations out in New York like the Taproot Foundation, or out in California in Alameda, with federally qualified health centers who are interested in this work. There's people who are doing this work who want to do it. Right? So don't forget them. One of the most important things with keeping the path and keeping the pace is not losing your partners along the way, because you're so focused on the people who are against you that you forget the folks who are with you. Don't forget the folks who are with you. So one of the things that we need to do to speed up the work, in addition to firming up our language and identifying what's legal and what's not, we have to be honest about the value of change and not minimize people's fears of the cost. Many times when I go into sessions and I'm listening to DEI councils, or I'm listening in employee resource groups meetings, or my team is in there doing focus groups with different types of groups, and they're listening to employees, a lot of conversation is about risk. And I just want to say very clearly that one of the ways that leaders are able to keep a good pace towards work that they said is strategically important to their organization is they always have to be able to monitor the difference between risks and threats, right? Risks are everywhere. My ceiling could fall down on me right now. That is a risk. The question is it a threat? Well, I trust the architect and I trust the builders who created this place that I'm in right now, and I don't think it's going to fall on me. So what's the difference between a risk and a threat? Well, a threat is a risk with power. A threat is a risk with power. And when it comes to certain workplaces, it's important to recognize that there may be a vocal minority of people who are against social change. They're against diversity. They're against equity and these things. Please don't make them the majority in your mind or in your strategy. A good comedian never writes their jokes for the critics. They write their jokes for the people who they know are going to laugh. Right? If you know that your organization is for this, and you know there's a group of conscientious people who want to do this work, then move forward with them. Don't let them fall off the train. Don't get distracted by the naysayers. Don't get confused or afraid because there are a couple voices who say, but what about? Well, actually, have some words with them. Invite them into the work, remind them of the value of the work, acknowledge the cost that they're saying they don't want to pay, but let them know that the organization is willing to pay that cost, whatever they may say that cost may be, even if that cost is a greater value, and keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. At the crux of this work for the practitioner, let me sum this up a little bit. There's this stuff systemically, legislative issues, there's organizational issues, right? Strategic issues. But at the end of the day, this work moves forward because of the practitioner. It moves forward because of the individual who's willing to make this work happen. It's happening by volunteers who are showing up to DEI council meetings and employee resource groups. Right? It's people who are willing to take a job in this day and age as a diversity, equity, inclusion lead. It's a person who's at a foundation and they're willing to do philanthropy using trust-based philanthropy models, not old school models for just like saying, hey, people who get a grant from us are lucky to get anything at all, right? It's these people who are ambitious and energetic and optimistic, and they're forward thinking, and they're reading up on literature about how we can do better, not just how we can create and implement best practices, how we can implement the next practices, right? We've got to understand that as practitioners, our job is to work with the people who want to move forward in the work we're trying to accomplish. Our job is to understand, assess, and engage in important but not full ways people who are detractors to this work. As a practitioner, you do need to know the difference. And in the last 7 or 8 months, we've seen, particularly those who are in the progressive or liberal space, we've seen this side of the political side of America start to fall apart and fight itself. We're seeing people who should be friends in this work make themselves enemies of each other in this work. And that is completely toxic to the progress of our work together. Everyone's not always going to agree. Everyone's not always going to feel completely visibilized and seen by everyone that they're working with. And given that that's never going to happen, it is important to know how to engage with decorum and respect, but it's also important to know how to tell the difference between someone who is a willing and able contributor in this work versus someone who is curious about this work versus someone who is just agnostic. Maybe they're so busy doing something else, but they're not against you. And knowing how to engage that person versus someone who actively disbelieves in the work you're talking about, but they're not going to fight you on it, versus someone who will be actively antagonistic and will not stop, will deploy resources and all of their power to stop what you're doing as it relates to equity, right? Like, you have to know how to differentiate between those 5 different types of people. You also need to understand when those types of spirits exist inside of your organization. When your institution, you may be working at a company that doesn't want to do DEI. You may be working at a foundation that doesn't want to think about trust-based philanthropy. You may be working at a nonprofit that doesn't want to think about diversification of their board. right? And you have to be able to tell the difference in the environment you're in, as well as the people that are within that environment across those 5 different areas of willingness, of active willingness, curiosity, agnosticism, disbelief, and antagonistic behaviors. If you don't know how to do that, then stay tuned. Justice Informed, we're going to be talking about that for the next several weeks. You can subscribe to our newsletter on our LinkedIn. You can check us out on our Instagram. You can follow me on my own personal page, or you can follow the Justice Informed page. We're going to be opening up the box of Pandora's tactics and frameworks for social change, and talking about this idea of path and pace and willingness, and how to manage these things in this type of an era that we're in right now, where it's not just that it's harder to do this work. There appears to be more risk in doing it, but we want to make sure that you're accurately differentiating between risks and threats. That said, if you have any questions, or if you're interested in us coming in and working with you, or if you gotta, just want to just sort of, blue sky an idea that you have about social impact, hit us up at info@justiceinformed.com, or send us a direct message on LinkedIn or on Instagram. We'd be happy to hear from you. My team's waiting to talk to anyone who's interested in this work. We're here to work with the willing. We're here to work with the curious. We're here to work with the agnostic. We're here to manage the people who are disbelievers, and we're here to protect everybody from those who are antagonistic. Hope to see you in the work soon. Let's get to it.